We have our database in place. We've set up our interface for our inventory utility, and we've also created the dependency injector so that we can swap out our static inventory utility to be something that's database driven. So now let's go ahead and actually do the work of setting up our database utility. I'm going to go ahead and right click into our quickly pos.business project, and I'm going to go into the data folder and choose add, and I'm going to add a class there. And this class will be my data actually I'll call it a database inventory utility. Database is kind of long, so we'll call it a DB inventory utility. All right, so it's a class just like any other. It's empty right now. We'll make it public. And then I'm going to go to the right-hand side of the class name. I'm going to put a colon. And what I need to do is define the interface that I want to implement for this utility. So it'll be an iInventory utility. So that is now in place. I'm going to get a red squiggle, and the reason for that is that there is a quick action that I can use that will allow me to quickly implement the interface that's needed, or implement the methods for this interface so I can implement the interface. So I'll click on that, and it'll actually drop in that method definition for me. So it makes a public list of products as the return type, and then the method name is called getInventory. And then it simply puts a throw new not implemented exception. So if I were to walk away and come back later and run my code, I'll get an error when I actually hit this method. So this is where we'll put all of our database work. So let's kind of just talk about the process of a database connection and what you need to do before we jump into the mechanics of actually getting this to work. So a database connection in .NET requires typically 3 objects to be used, and they kind of are used together. They're kind of coordinated or orchestrated together. So we have a connection, and that connection is the object that manages the actual physical connection between your server, your computer, and the database server that's running somewhere else. And that could be running on your computer, but in theory, it's running somewhere else. It's a separate process. So this object manages that connection. You use it to open the connection. You use it to close the connection. All of that work is done by the connection object. There's very little work that you do as the developer utilizing that object. It's simply to open and close the connection, but the rest of the ADO.NET space or the system.data classes utilize the connection object. All right, so we need a connection, we need a command, and then we need a way of actually reading or getting the data, and this is done typically by a data reader. There's also a data adapter, which we won't really cover in this lecture, but that's another piece that you can use. It's especially useful if you're trying to take snapshots of database data and load them into memory. You can do large pulls using the data adapter. All right, so we'll have to set up these 3 objects. In the command, we'll have to set up our select statement, and that's our SQL statement. In the connection, we'll have to define our connection string, and that's how we tell the connection object how to connect to the database. And then with the data reader, we will loop through rows, and with those rows, we will create product objects. All right, so to get things going, I'm actually going to jump into the object browser, which is under view. And this is just so you can kind of see what's going on here mechanically and what the pieces are. So we'll be dealing in the system.data namespace, and we'll be looking specifically at the SQL client, so system.data.SQL client. You'll notice here that there's other namespaces as well. You have system.data.odbc, which is a type of technology for connecting to databases, system.data.oledb, and there's also a system.data.SQL. There's a provider base, SQL types, and system.xml is actually parts of it are underneath system.data. You can also download or get additional libraries that would exist and function within the system.data or ADO.NET area. But specifically for this, since we're using a SQL server, we'll use the system.data.SQL client namespace. Inside of that namespace, there's a whole lot of objects. But the ones that are of interest to us, and these are the ones that you should be interested in whenever you're utilizing a database in .NET, they all typically follow the same pattern. There's a connection object. So for us, it's SQL.connection or SQL connection. There's a command object, and then there's a data reader object, and then there's also that data adapter I talked about. Now, something to note with each one of these class types is that I'm going to look down here in this lower right-hand box. You'll see here that SQL connection inherits system.data.common.db connection. SQL command inherits system.data.common.db command. The data reader, system.data.common.db data reader, and the adapter, system.data.common.db data adapter. Now, these are utility classes or abstracts that will allow you to go in and create your own if you were a company that had your own database engine. But the thing that is most interesting is when you jump into these common.db objects, you'll see here that they actually implement their own interfaces as well. We can't see them here, so I'm going to hit F12. And, oh, it won't let me see them here either. Oh, I can see it here under the base types. Okay. So what is implemented with each one of these is this IDB connection. There's an IDB command. So these are interfaces that are defined that define the basic mechanics of all the ADO.NET database connections, database commands, and so forth. So these are the real kind of big pieces that you'll need to learn and become familiar with, because in a good implementation, you should see these being used in all those facets. So those are just things to consider as you're working with the objects. And if you kind of get overwhelmed by all the things that are there, just simply going back to those interfaces and saying, okay, these are the basic mechanics of what are needed to get my connection working, I'm going to utilize those. All right, so let's go ahead and let's start by doing SQL connection. That'll be our object, and we're going to get a quick actions so we can drop in our using statement for system.data.sql client. And I'm just going to call this my con object. So it's a con variable of type SQL connection. And then I'll say new SQL connection. And now we have our connection object. So the next step is for us to define the connection string. Now, to get the connection string, I like to go out to a website called connectionstrings.com. And at connectionstrings.com, they have all kinds of different connection strings for all kinds of different databases. The one we're going to use is SQL Server. We'll want to choose the .NET Framework data provider for SQL. And we can utilize, we can either use this first one or this second one. Either one of them will work in our case because you're running the SQL Server locally on your machine as well. So I'm going to go ahead and go with the trusted connection. It's the easiest to manage, but the standard security is basically server name, database name, username, and password. So if you recall the username, the SA username and password you set up, you can freely use those as well. But for ease, if you're using the local SQL instance on your machine, we'll go ahead and just use the trusted connection. All right, so let's flip back here. So then we're going to say con.connection string equals, and then we're going to put this in quotes. And this will be the very first go around for us to get this up and running. So your server, and this is very dependent on your computer, but typically it's probably something like parentheses local / SQL Express. If you have a SQL Express installation, that's what your connection string will be. If you're using something else, like a full SQL install, you may just need to put parentheses local. If you're not sure, you can always come back to your Server Explorer, and you can see here, my desktop is, or this machine is actually called desktop, and then some letters / SQL Express. I could also use that as my server name, but I know it's my local machine, so you can use the token local. I actually need 2 slashes to escape the slash in my string. And then the name of my database is the Quickly POS database. So my database name will be Quickly POS database. And then I'm just going to leave that as a trusted connection. And I'll hit semicolon. Now, we've hard-coded this connection string into the utility class. This is actually not the best way to do it, and I'll show you a step later on how to take it out of here and move it into a configuration file. But for now, to not bounce you around too much, we'll just go with that. All right, so now we've got our connection set up. So now we can do a SQL command. Now I'm just going to call it CMD. And there's a few ways that you can create the command. You can do new SQL command, and you can pass in the command text or the command text in the connection. There's some other overloads as well. Or one of the ways that I like to do it, which actually makes it a lot easier, is you can say con, go back to your connection, and say create command. And the connection object will actually create the command object for you. So that's really nice. And then we need to set up the select statement. So cmd dot command text. And we just set that equal to the select statement. So select all from products. So that'll select all the rows from our products table. So we've got all of the pieces defined for us to start connecting to our database and pulling data. So we're going to do a few things here now. We're going to start with a try catch block. Since we're connecting to a database, we always want to make sure that we are doing it safely and that we don't crash our application if something were to happen. So we'll do a try catch block there. And then here we will start by opening the connection. So we'll say con.open. And then we can tell our command to execute, and we want to execute a reader. Now when we call execute reader, there's a few overloads, and there's one that I particularly like to use is the one that takes the command behavior. And that command behavior tells the data reader what to do when it's done reading. And I like to choose close connection, so that way I don't have to worry about calling close at the end. So this is the command we need, but we need to capture, because execute reader returns back to us a SQL data reader. So we're going to do SQL data reader, reader will be the name of the variable, and we're going to capture that object. So now we need to loop through the rows and create our products. So to do that, we'll do a while loop. We'll say reader.read. So while the reader is reading, we're going to do our work. Now the first step in our work will be for us to start to pull data out of the products table. So I'm going to expand the table so I can see my column names. That'll make it really helpful and easy when I start to pull data out. The goal here is that we're going to have a product. I'm going to call it new P. And we want to set up that product. So I'm going to use the inline initialization piece of C# to do this. And it makes it so we don't have to keep saying new P dot, and then calling all the properties. Instead, we can come inside of here and we can say the description equals, and then we'll say reader, square bracket, and it'll either take the index or the name of the field. So this is the description, so I'll say dot or description in the square brackets. And these are typically returned as object types, and so we have to cast them. So this will be cast as a string. And then we'll do comma, and then we'll do name equals, and this will be a string again, reader name, comma, unit price, and now this one will be treated as a float, reader, unit price, UPC code, this is also a string, reader, UPC code. Now we're missing one field from our database that's not in our products class, and that's ID. So I'm going to go ahead and just type ID in, and I'm going to cast it as an integer. I'm going to say reader ID. Now ID is coming up with a red squiggle, and that's because we don't have an ID property in the products class. So I'm going to use my quick action, and it says, hey, I can generate that property for you if you'd like. And I'm like, sure. So I'm going to click that, and Visual Studio just went into my products class and created that ID property for me. So I don't have to go back to products and do that work. Now the only problem with this is that it tries to do its best guess, and it's very conservative. So if I actually jump into the ID property and I press F12 here, I was clicked on ID and pressed F12, it brings me in, but it says it's a public get with an internal set. And the internal could cause some problems for me in the future, but for now I'm going to leave it, because that way if I set the ID, no other piece of code can jump in here and change that ID. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it like it is. And that now creates a new product object. Now we need to pack all of these products into a collection. Now we want to do that outside the scope of the try-catch block. We don't want to declare the collection inside of here, because if we do, then we'll lose the ability to access it once we get out of the try-catch block. So I'm going to come all the way back up to the top. I'm just going to make a section called variables, and this will be a list of product. And I'll call it my COL, or collection of products, and I'll set it equal to a new collection. So either way, we're always going to have a collection to return. It just may be empty. So then the last step will be collection of products.add, and we'll add the new P. And now we've added that new product to the collection. So while this loop runs, it's going to create a new product and add it to the collection every time. And every time it calls read, when it loops back, it's going to return a Boolean of yes, it can read to the next row, or no, it can't. And if it can, then it'll move to that next row in the collection of data coming from the database. All right, so we have that in place. And then the catch, actually the last step here will then say reader.close. And that closes the connection. Now, typically when we call reader.close, if you do not identify this command behavior of close connection, this will simply close the reader. It does not close the connection itself. But since we said close connection, it all happens at once. Now with our catch, we want to catch an exception that may get thrown. And I'm just going to go ahead and rethrow it since we're inside of our business class, our class library. And the reason for that is I want that error to bubble up to the UI, and then we'll have to do another try catch block inside of the UI to see what the exception is, and then give something like a message box versus throwing up a big hairy message that just blows up the entire application. All right, so we've essentially built our utility class. We have all the pieces in place. So let's make 2 changes to our app and see if it runs. So let's go into our dependency injector. I'm going to comment out that line. I did that with a control KC, and then we're going to return new DB inventory utility, and that lives in a different namespace, so we'll have to come back here, use our quick actions, and add that using statement. So we've now replaced the dependency injector's configuration to use the database utility instead of using the static one. And really that's it. So let's go ahead and start it and see what happens. Oh, we have a build error, so I'm going to choose no because I want to see what my error is. And my error here says not all code paths return a value. Forgot my last step. So after the catch, I actually need to return my collection of products. So return collection of products. So that's important, otherwise the code will not run. So let's go and try it again. All right, so things ran. I'm going to click add item to order, and we get another exception. The specified cast is not valid. So there's a cast that I'm calling inside of our code that the .NET code does not like. So up here in my reader, I'm doing a cast that it does not like. So let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump all the way back up to the, well, let's go ahead and stop it and we'll start it again. So we're back here, so we'll hit add item to order. And we're inside of our reader now. And we can actually use, if you have this configuration set up down below in debug mode, you can come to the immediate window and we can actually type in our code here and have it run to see what we're getting back. So we can say reader description, and that'll give us back orange ball. And then we can say reader name, that should be our basketball. We can say reader unit price, $20. We can say reader UPC code, and that is what we need, reader ID, and that has a number. So one of these casts is throwing an exception. So I'm going to guess it's probably the float. So let's do parentheses float, reader, unit price, and hit enter. And that did throw an exception. So why did it throw an exception? That's the question. says it's an invalid cast. So does it need it to be a different type? Perhaps. Let's try a double. Invalid cast. And let's try a decimal. And it accepted the decimal. Interesting. Okay, so it's returning us a decimal type from the database. So we need to then do some casts conversions to make all of that work. So let's come back here, and this is going to be a decimal type. And then I'm going to try to use the convert utility that's part of the .NET framework. So let's do convert to single. A single is a float type, but inside of the Common Language Runtime, it's referred to as a single. And let's see if we can do that. So let's go ahead and run it again. And let's try it again. Ah, success. All right, so let's drop down on our products and see what we have. So I have basketball, baseball, football, beach ball, soccer ball, and then in my database, I added an additional type called golf ball. So my golf ball shows up. I can choose add to order. Basketball shows up. We can add 2 to the order. And everything looks like it's working. So let's try something interesting. So our app is still running. I'm going to go up to View. I'm going to go to the Server Explorer. I'm going to right click on Products Table. I'm going to say Show Table Data. And let's see, what's another type of ball that we could add? We'll do a wiffle ball. Right. Holy, that's it. Oh, that's my UPC code. 9876. Holy. And we'll say it's 250. So we've now added another record to our database. So if we jump back to our app, we're going to say add item to order, drop it down, and there's the wiffle ball. So we added the item to the database, and then by going back and relaunching, now if I was in here and I added it, it would not work because we've already added the item and already pulled it from the database. But by launching this form again on form load, that's when I go to the database and pull the products. So I can drop down and now select the wiffle ball, and I can buy 10 of them and add those to my order as well. So we've successfully now configured and connected our application to the database, and things are up and running.